identifying the displacement of people as one of the great scourges of our time. We hardly needed that report. It has been obvious for some years now that a characteristic feature of the post-Cold War world, of the New World disorder, has been massive enforced displacement of people. And it begins to resemble in its scale the displacement of people in the mid-20th century in World War II and in the wake of World War II. That is part of a wider phenomenon of global movement, of economic migration. We are returning, in economic terms, to the era of globalization prior to World War I, when millions of people crossed the oceans from Europe in particular, but not only from Europe, also from Asia, to seek economic opportunities in North America and Australasia and elsewhere. So from a historian's point of view, there are obvious analogies. We've seen this kind of large-scale violent displacement. We've seen ethnic cleansing before. And we have seen mass economic migration before. What is unusual is to see these things simultaneously, because in the past, they were quite separate processes. The great economic migration of the 19th century happened at a time when European empires existed in a relatively stable relationship to one another, and there was great asymmetry between those empires and non-European states. The age of mass forced displacement of population happened as those empires were disintegrating and fighting with one another in the middle of the 20th century. This is something I wrote about in a book called War of the World, which identified the 20th century as a time of sustained conflict in which annihilation or forced resettlement of populations became a policy tool in pursuit of homogenized nation states and empire states, as I called them. We have been deluding ourselves about the scale of this problem because we have not wanted to face the implications of the disintegration of the state order in the broader Middle East, in the Middle East and North Africa, and one might also say extending into South Asia, that began in the early part of the 2000s. This process would probably have happened anyway, but the overthrow of Saddam Hussein and the disintegration of Iraq acted as a catalyst for a revolution in the political structure, and not only of the Arab world, but one might say a large part of the Muslim world. And this process is not by any means near its end. In fact, I will risk a prediction. Next year will be more violent than this year, just as this year has been more violent than last year, in terms, A, of armed conflict, and B, of terrorism in the Muslim world and in places outside the Muslim world where there are large numbers of Muslims. It is statistically irrefutable that since the 1990s, the share of armed conflict and the share of terrorism accounted for in one way or another by Muslims has gone up. Samuel Huntington's famous line about Islam having bloody borders and innards has certainly been true in our time, though it clearly has not been true through all of history. Something specific has happened in our time to radicalize this part of the world and to turn this religion into something more like a political ideology. As a result of this process, millions of people are moving. Syria alone, the civil war there alone, has displaced millions of people. And we sit here and experience the ripples that are huge waves in the Middle East. And we do not have yet a coherent answer to the problem. We are in an agony about the fate of refugees seeking to cross the Mediterranean in makeshift vessels. We wring our hands about the people traffickers, and yet we do not know how to contain this human wave. When people arrive in our countries, we struggle to understand how best to integrate them economically, something I talked about yesterday, as well as socially and culturally. Our own postmodern multicultural aspirations make it harder than it ever was before for us to create and enforce some common idea of citizenship. And this is not a problem peculiar to any one country or another. I see this not only in continental Europe, not only in the United Kingdom, I see it increasingly in the United States. I see it in the Boston area. So this is perhaps the biggest challenge of our time. How do we cope? The challenge is a twofold challenge. It is not only a challenge of how we integrate new citizens into our democracies when they arrive with attitudes that are profoundly different from our own. How does one cope with the fact that around 80% of people coming from Bangladesh, coming from Pakistan, coming from Iraq, coming from Somalia, believe that apostates, people who leave Islam, like my wife, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, should be killed? The Pew Attitude surveys revealed that that is the level of support for the death penalty for apostasy in many large Muslim-majority countries that are sending substantial numbers of migrants to the West. How do we cope with that kind of a mismatch between our commitment to tolerance, believe what you will, a commitment that was recently underscored by European parliamentarians, and that view that apostasy deserves the death penalty? That is a huge challenge. The other huge challenge is, how do we deal with the strategic problem? We have given up on strategy. We have military alliances without military doctrine, without military capability. Does NATO, of which this country is a member, really exist other than on paper? That is the question that President Putin asks himself each morning. And he is strongly tempted to find out, I can assure you. The temptation is an extremely powerful one, because it seems so likely that it is just a paper edifice. As we have no capability to deal with the strategic problem of the disintegration of the Middle East, as we simply watch, making ineffectual airstrikes, mainly for the purposes of giving CNN something to show, as we engage in these futile decapitation efforts against the jihadist network, we are allowing this problem to grow, and grow exponentially. Let me conclude with an analogy. Imagine in the Cold War, if an American president had said, communism is an ideology of peace. Imagine if we had welcomed members of the Bolshevik Party and encouraged them to set up centers for Bolshevism in our cities. That is our current posture in response to the massive ideological threat to our freedoms posed by radical Islam. The Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, and most people, including American journalists, reported it as a minor event, potentially even a good thing, rather as they reported the Iranian Revolution as potentially a good thing. It wasn't until the mid-1920s that the Bolsheviks had successfully consolidated their hold on the Russian Empire as a result of brutal violence towards their rivals. In 10 years' time, if we look back and say, we allowed Islamic State to go from being junior varsity Al-Qaeda, in the president's unfortunate phrase, to being a real state in control of the Arab oil wealth, we'll have made the same mistake we made when we allowed the Bolsheviks to gain control of the Russian Empire. So this is not only a problem of assimilation and immigration. This is a strategic problem. And unless we address the strategic problem, we are not going to be able to stop the wave of migration.
Thank you.
Jan Johansen, author, and for the first panelist, or as we say in German, Freie Schweizer. I found extremely interesting the way you talk about democracy in terms of rules of law compared to democracy re-elections. We have the case of Hungary, which many in the EU regards as atypical. I think we see the same trends in other countries. And God knows, I say God knows what will happen in Poland after the next election. Could you talk a little about that? Do you see Hungary as more typical for the future, or is it atypical?
Yes, to repeat the question for those of you who didn't hear in the back, is the rise of forms like democratic developments in Hungary and the like typical or atypical of the development within democracies?
I think, first of all, one ought to reflect on how well things have gone in Central and Eastern Europe since 1989. They might very well have gone a lot worse. The historical record of that part of the world, when it tried democracy in the aftermath of World War I, was pretty bad. And relatively few democracies created after World War I survived long enough to be overthrown by Hitler. Most of them had gone before the Nazis turned up. Czechoslovakia was a rare exception. So we need to understand that something remarkably good happened after the fall of the communist regimes. And it was good economically, Poland being the real success story. But it was also good politically, in the sense that without too much trouble, West European styles of government took root. It would have been amazing if, in the wake of the biggest financial crisis, arguably since 1929, there had not been some increase in populism everywhere. And it would have been astonishing if it had not occurred in at least some East European countries. Right now, I'm much less worried about populist movements in Europe than I am about the phenomenon of Islamic extremism. So let me try and prioritize my worries. After all, I don't want to leave you too depressed. The European Union has many faults, and people in my country, the United Kingdom, love pointing them out. But we should acknowledge that its greatest success has been in facilitating the rapid and smooth transition to democracy in Eastern Europe. And one of its tricks that I really admire is the way that it subtly delegitimizes leaders, governments that step too far to the right or to the left. It's clever. They did it to Jörg Haider, if you remember, when he came to power in Austria. So this has been done before. It's not necessary to go all the way to sanctions. There are ways in which the European Union can exert pressure through financial channels. It's doing it very publicly to Greece now. There are quite a ways in which it can be done and is being done to Hungary. One big worry that I have is that Russia is meddling in the domestic politics of more and more European countries, usually by making direct payments to bad actors in the political landscape. But this is not an East European or Central European problem. This is a general European problem because it affects France. One of the things that will really change the game of European politics will be the next French presidential election. One cannot at this point confidently rule out a victory by the Front National. I would not have said that a year ago. A year ago, I would have said it always ends in a second round, and in the second round, the center-left and the center-right join forces to defeat Le Pen. I'm not sure that's necessarily going to happen. So I think we need to watch not just Hungary. I don't worry too much about Hungary. We need to watch France. Because the populist force, with or without Russian backing, is at work everywhere, in almost every European country. But it's a game changer if it elects a French president.
Thank you. In the back there.
Thank you very much. My name is Civita. I'm president of European Movement in Norway. Two questions. One, do you see the European Union as a hierarchical board and network organization? Second, do you see Angela as a group leader? For instance,
Thank you. For those of you who are in the front here, is the EU hierarchical or not? And is Angela Merkel a good leader?
I'm sure those two questions are wholly unrelated to one another. Thank you. Excellent questions. The European Union is a far more network-like organization than any previous institution set up to unite Europe. But that's not saying much. Clearly, it's a lot more horizontal in its structure than, say, Napoleon's European empire, or indeed Charles V's. So one has to acknowledge that a characteristic feature of European institutions is that they overrepresent the small countries. The number of countries in the European Union with less than 6 million people is quite large. What is it, 11 or so? So a substantial number of member states are smaller than a Chinese city. I think there are more than 11 Chinese cities now with a population above 6 million. So from a Chinese vantage point, there's something really strange about the European Union because it overrepresents in the system of qualified majority voting these mini countries. If Scotland had voted for independence, the number of mini countries would presumably have gone up again. So I think one has to acknowledge that from the vantage point of the most powerful, the biggest, and economically strongest country, Germany, the European Union is a kind of restraining mechanism that diminishes, dilutes the power that Germany would wield. And monetary union was a part of that process, because in effect, monetary union reduced German power over monetary policy, which previously had essentially been wielded by the Bundesbank, an all-German institution that everybody had to follow or suffer the consequences. Nevertheless, when all is said and done, after all the qualified majority votes are in, Germany remains the dominant, the biggest, the strongest power. And its economic dominance has magnified that in the crisis of the single currency. And that has meant that the power of the German chancellor has grown. I think this is all much better than if the European Union didn't exist. So let me be clear. Although I had my grave doubts about the wisdom of creating a single currency, I'm not one of those British Eurosceptics who would like the European Union just to go away. I don't believe it can become a federal state. Bundesrepublik Europa seems to me an unrealistic vision. But it's interesting that that phrase I first heard from Angela Merkel, speaking some years ago at Davos, when she said that her vision of Europe was Bundesrepublik Europa, with essentially the institutions of the German Federal Republic writ large. One can see why that would be appealing to a German leader, because those institutions have worked a lot better than any previous set of German political institutions. But I think it's inevitable that as a consequence, she emerges as the answer to the old Kissinger question. You'll remember the Kissinger question. Who do I call when I want to speak to Europe? Who do I call when I want to speak to Europe? There never was an answer to that question in the 1970s or in the 1980s. By the 1990s, you kind of had to call Bonn, or rather Berlin, and Paris, because this sort of seemed like the French and Germans had a duumvirate. That was the time of Merkozy. Who now talks of Merkozy or Mercolande? Nobody. Because if you want to talk to Europe, you call Angela Merkel. That is new. Helmut Kohl, extraordinarily able politician as he was, never had that. So the question then is a very important one. How good is she? Angela Merkel is deeply impressive. When you meet her, you're struck by a certain subtle imperiousness that is intimidating. I remember seeing her with another European leader, I shan't say who. And I was struck by how canine he became in her presence, how dog-like. Don't know if you have a dog, but you know how dogs try to please you by kind of, they sort of jump around looking up at you. It was a bit like that. And I began to see why she is such a formidable political force. Great authority, great intelligence, cool and calculating. But I believe Angela Merkel has a flaw. And it is a flaw she shares with less capable democratic leaders. She has no strategic vision, really. The vision of Bundesrepublik Europa is not one that will inspire a generation of Europeans. It may indeed fill them with dread. She is a tactician. She has shown herself to be an extraordinarily gifted tactician. Throughout this tedious crisis, the sort of soap opera of the Grexit, she has been the superior poker player. But to be a great tactician is not to be a great leader. To be a great leader, you need to have some strategic vision that should guide you before the data are in. Because you can't make the big decisions just waiting for the data to come in. That Federal Reserve style of decision-making can't work at the level of European politics or any politics. So I would say that we will look back and say, not for the first time in history, the Germans were incredibly good tactically, but not very good strategically.
Thank you. I have many on the list here, but I think we'll take one next question there, and we'll see whether we have time enough.
My name is Ivan Hoffman. I'm a semi-retired bureaucrat. Is the rise of failed state an inevitable consequence, or at least aided by the power that networks are taking over from big states, and which type of networks?
There have been failed states throughout history, and parts of the world where there was no state at all. I don't think one can therefore say that the advent of social media or new technologies made it more likely that states would fail. Somalia was failing long before anyone there had heard of a cell phone, much less the internet. I think it would be more accurate to say that as imperial structures retreat, so vacuums of power inevitably arise. And in some of those contexts, it proves impossible to create a stable state. I've spent a lot of the last 10 or so years thinking about empire, because empire is the perennial political structure. The nation state is a novelty, historically. For most of history, political organizations that succeeded were imperial in character, all over the world. And we had a kind of fractal geometry of power. You might find yourself in a city-state, sort of minimalist unit of political organization with walls around it, well defended, able to raise taxes, put armies in the field, see off besieging hordes. But you might also have found yourself in something much larger that brought together multiple city-states and agrarian areas into an empire. So most of what historians study is in fact a history of empire. This is very difficult to do if you're ideologically convinced that imperialism is evil. Because you can't really study an institution if you are biased in, against it on principle. But if you can put aside your ideological preconceptions and realize that empires are just about always there, then you begin to see that there are good and bad empires. The German Empire of the 1940s was about the worst of modern times. The British and American empires, and I use the term American empire advisedly, have been relatively benign empires. The problem is that when empires go, when they retreat, that is when violence escalates. The most violent time in many ways in the history of British India was the end, the period of British withdrawal, partition, and massive communal violence. The end of American empire in the Middle East, and I think it's not too much to call it that, is being followed by just the same pattern of communal violence. The United States essentially underwrote the political order of the Middle East with some support from Britain from the 1950s. In the 1970s, that was particularly apparent. Under this president, the United States has explicitly walked away from its role as the guarantor of order in the Middle East. It has essentially undercut its allies. It has made deals or sought to make deals with its principal foe, Iran. Explicitly, the president said over the Syrian use of chemical weapons that he was not, quote, the global policeman. He drew a red line. It turned out to be a pink dotted line. You know the story. So I think what we see at the moment is a typical pattern of post-imperial chaos. It doesn't take much to cause a state to fail. Look at Libya. Look how quickly Libya fell apart. We all probably quietly celebrated the demise of Gaddafi, who was a pretty egregious individual and whose regime had certainly sponsored some hideous acts of terrorism. But now look at Libya. So this is really, I think, what is going on. The networks, particularly the malign network that I talked about of Islamic State and its ilk, those flourish in states that have failed. In a sense, their success is a consequence of the breakdown of state structures. You described yourself as a semi-retired bureaucrat. Is there any other kind? But let's not give bureaucrats too bad a name. Ultimately, the notion of bureaucracy, of formal, predictable, regimented public governance is a good one. The idea that there should be non-corrupt, salaried officials who carried out, provided public services beginning with law, order, justice, was a fantastically good idea. And not only a Western idea, because it was at the heart of the Chinese imperial system. Indeed, in many ways, the Chinese imperial system was more bureaucratic than the typical European system. So we should remember, as we complain about bureaucracy, don't we all, that there are worse things than semi-retired bureaucrats. And living in a failed state is a lot worse than dealing with bureaucrats.
Thank you for those closing words and for coming with us. Just before the round of applause, just one note. We are in a bit of a hurry, so please be seated until Professor Ferguson has, as they say, left the building. So he'll manage to get out and get a taxi before he's attacked by more questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Excellent.